My presentation is really about an introduction to me, but also to my students, because I think both are quite critical in understanding the teaching context in which I work and where my students live and where they are students. So I begin with this image, which is very mundane, because I value the mundane. I try to value the extraordinary and the ordinary in my teaching. So this is an image that most of my students will understand immediately when they see it on day one of GES 225, Mobility, Space and Place in Southern Africa. Because for me, as a human geographer and a mobility scholar, teaching in the context of Cape Town, I want them to actually engage with everyday practice. So in this one image, we see all the constituents of mobility. We see governance in how mobility happens. We see how some people are stuck and some people have to move. We understand something about the past. You can't see the sign here, but the sign on the right says Jan Smuts. So the naming conventions and how we understand place and how that it's inscribed in everyday experience. And then of course, traffic. When people in Cape Town talk about being stuck in traffic, I say, you're not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic. So it's this kind of everyday experience that I try to harness in my work. So when I begin my teaching, I have to do a deep introspection about who am I. And in my case, my core belief as a geographer is that geography is everywhere, that it's all around us. And if we don't actually grasp that, and actually use that as a starting point, and we're missing something quite critical. So that actually helps to inform my teaching philosophy. What I'm trying to do essentially is to turn the theory-praxis nexus on its head and start with practice, and then allow that to inform theory. So for my students, if I were to approach them and say, read all these critical scholars, most of whom come from the global north, because they're going to enable you to be clever, they come back to me and say, what does that actually mean in my context? So what we do is we start the other way around, and we start with practice, and then we allow that to inform theory and illustrate theory. And by doing so, we actually learn some things which are quite unexpected, which I'll talk about just now. In terms of my teaching goals, I have three sort of primary goals in what I'm trying to do. I actually need to understand who my students are. So I need to understand what home languages they practice every day, where they stay, who they are. They need to know who I am as well. And by doing so, we then understand that we're coming to the table with embedded knowledges that we can actually build off of. So my students, even in GES 111, first year, first semester, fresh out of matric, they come to my classroom knowing something. So I can't assume they know nothing. And I'm going to be the expert that's going to build them up. Yes, I have expert knowledge, and we have to use that. But it's valuing their knowledge as well. The second goal is very dangerous in these particular times because I want to disrupt. But I want to disrupt the architecture of the classroom. If you think about lecture theaters, a V-shaped room, generally speaking, where the focus is on me, me, me. You know nothing, I know everything, be quiet. Now, there is value in that, as we learned from Prof. Elias in this morning's keynote, and a very critical learning we can take away from lectures. But I actually want to get beyond that and try to reconfigure how knowledge is taught. And then thirdly, I want to try to extend the spaces of learning, so go beyond the classroom. So when they leave the lecture theater, the learning doesn't stop. So in doing all of this, I had a very cathartic event in this first year class, where students stood up amongst 400 students, very brave, and said, what can you teach me about mobility? I live it every day. What do you know? And that actually enabled me to think, well, they do know something, and we need to engage in that. So that was quite an important moment for me. I won't go through all of this in terms of the detail because you're the experts here. But my teaching practice is really focused on authentic and situated learning. Again, I won't belabor the points about where that comes from and what situatedness means, but it's really essentially about learning which you can actually reflect in everyday experience. So the context of everyday is the arena for learning and also reflects back on that as well. So just as a few examples that I'll talk about in my first year module, one thing I asked them to do is I have them do an online survey using Google Forms where I learn more about their daily journey to campus. So they learn something about quantitative data, what that means. They do this online, but we articulate it in the classroom. So we talk about this. The results are shown in real time. Some students are still doing it when the lecture is actually taking place. We also have qualitative questions as well. And what this generally does is spark conversation and debate within the lecture theater itself when this is shown. The second year module, one of the most eye-opening pieces of learning for me, because I'm also learning in the module, was the example of students actually taking their everyday practice, reflecting on it through mobile diaries, and actually pushing the theory forward. So the theorization of different mobile subjects, the Amagoduko, the Amatipa, all these various mobile subjects who move with degrees of regularity or irregularity, are people that the mobility scholars don't talk about. And here it was illuminated because of this theory-praxis shift. Same thing for tourism. We actually harness the understanding of tourism through the students' everyday experience of tourism. So I have students who stay in Kailicha who didn't understand. At first they thought, well, we know nothing about tourism because we're not tourists. Meanwhile, Lookout Hill in Kailicha is a tourist site. And they began to value that and now understand how tourism impacts on their community. And then we used those reflections and those images, so this was a visual project, to feed back to the public on this project's website as well. Various ways we build this knowledge up, through concept mapping, through scaffolded assessment. Again, to put a fine point on the need to be together, to be physically proximate with your learning. Well, we have an online component, but we have to sit together to do this discussion, to do photo interpretation, to do peer review, which altogether actually helps to ensure an authentic learning environment that's student-centered, that's applicable in real-world situations, so my students know what this means and how they can apply it. And it's particularly socially embedded in practice as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley. Sarah, you're next. We're now going to listen to Sarah Smith from the University of South Africa.
Hello everyone. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation, which is probably a decision I'm going to regret for the rest of my life. And it's also ironic because I'm pretty sure I won this award for how much technology I use in my module. Kind of let myself down here. But anyway, I teach legal philosophy at UNISA, and just to give you some context, to my module. I teach between 1,300 to 2,000 students a semester. My students are based all around the world. I really dislike it when I get exam papers from the Bahamas, and I have to try and mark those ones very objectively while I sit in an office in Pretoria and they are scuba diving. So let me begin by saying thank you to HELTASA and the CILT for taking the time to read my application, listening to my ramblings, and for recognizing my work. I cannot claim all the responsibility for this. My colleagues, the Department of Jurisprudence, and the College of Law, and my often abandoned husband are all equal partners in this. I also come from a line of teachers. My grandfather, both my parents, an uncle, and two of my stepmothers were teachers. In fact, some of my undergraduate peers were taught by my parents. And when they spoke to me about being taught by my father, it was always as if they were remembering a friend. However, one of those colleagues or friends referred to my mother, who is here today, as the Dragon Lady. However, I also know that my mother taught Reedy Direco, and Reedy Direco has often referred to my mother as probably the teacher who has had the greatest influence on her life. So I have that background, which has definitely helped me in my teaching. Legal philosophy is a module which many students and unfortunately some lecturers believe is irrelevant to legal practice. In fact, I know of lecturers who have taught legal philosophy and they feel that it is a module better suited to students who only have a research focus. I think this is a very problematic approach. If a student views legal philosophy as abstracted from legal practice, as just a module they have to get through to get their degree, and then are faced with the new terminology that we use and some very strange ideas that philosophy tends to bring up, then they're going to feel very negatively towards the module. And they're not going to dedicate sufficient time towards the module, not understand the content, and quite probably end up disliking the module. And this was definitely reflected in the pass rate when I joined the legal philosophy team. So during my time lecturing this module, I have tried to change this perspective. I've changed the pedagogy from a predominantly cognitivist pedagogy to a constructivist one with elements of connectivism. I try to teach in a manner that shows how legal philosophy is relevant to the practice of law and how it is an add-on to every other module they will do in the law degree. I also try to locate the module within the student's reality. And importantly, and I think this is very important, I try to make it fun. So to achieve this, I have created YouTube videos, and unfortunately I can't relate to Prof. Eleasor's speech significantly, number one, because of the number of students I have and because they're not close to me. So I created YouTube videos, and those videos must have been watched now over 25,000 times. I also have podcasts. I use the smartboard and the document camera. And I have a lot of other tools which are online which the students can use to interact with the module. My latest experiments have been experimenting with cartoons, interactive mind maps, and using CrowdGrader as a new form of assessment. And I would recommend CrowdGrader to the lecturers that are here. It's a really good way of bringing students back into the assessment process. So these all provide new and different ways and tools that students use to get to grips with the content. And students use these tools while driving to work, they use them while they're at gym, and they even watch my videos while they're in the bath. Why they tell me that, I'm not really sure, but because a lot of my students work, they have to find whatever time they can to do their studies. And so it's great that they have all these opportunities or these tools to use which can fit into whatever time they have. And they've responded very positively, and this is being represented in my pass rate, which has increased by between 30 to 35%. And then when I do give lectures and have one-on-ones with my students, I try to make them as interactive and exciting as possible. When we talk about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and the social contract, I talk about how this was reflected in the movie The Dark Knight Rises. When we discuss the difference between sex and gender, we're talking about female athletics. I spend an excessive amount of time explaining Plato's ideals and how good-looking I find Ewan McGregor. I also use a lot of personal experience to show students how legal philosophy informs my life. My recent stint as the maid of honor at my friend Lucy's white and traditional wedding gave me a great platform from which to discuss white privilege, and from there lead to a discussion on critical race theory. I try to teach Ubuntu as a living practice, rather than just a principle that was once used in the Makwanyane death penalty case. And I teach Rawls's theory of justice by playing a game I call the equality cake. And I actually use a literal cake when I do that, because the majority of my students can relate to chocolate cake. And so when you're talking about an eccentric lecturer, I think I probably do fall into that category. I also take the time to explain to students, 1 minute, oh, I thought I was going to be quick, that legal philosophy can be the difference between being a good legal practitioner and the potential to be a constitutional court justice. I need to produce graduates who are going to play with the law, who look at legal concepts from new perspectives, who understand the role that law plays in the economic, social, and political lives of South Africans. Lawyers who realize that sometimes the law that we have does not reflect our constitutional values, and that it needs to be changed, and that they are going to be the people responsible for doing that. I have some pretty high ideals for my tuition and my students. But as the saying goes, when you shoot for the moon, even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. And I certainly feel like that today, being amongst the other wonderful winners of these awards who do some amazing work. I've had an incredible amount of fun teaching this module. It's a huge privilege to teach students, and being recognized for this privilege, I'm done. And for having the amount of fun that I have had is fantastic. So thank you very much, everybody.